When we start opening to weave, and we talked about having this euphoric, maybe almost manic sometimes feeling when this starts happening, this awakening, or even this dysphoric despair, if we don't fully feel the love of what we are seeing behind the veils lifting, because sometimes there can be, some things that are terrifying within the awakening process. And if we do not have the compassion of grace within that process, that can feel very hopeless and helpless and despairing. And so, Spirit wants us to know that there are frequent errors that are made when we first begin opening to weave. And the first is that we may mistake the false light, or what Spirit calls the third eye codes, as true weave instead of partial truth. And there's a lot of false light third eye codes out there, especially on the internet right now. There's a lot of gurus. There's a lot of people claiming to know a lot of things, and maybe they do, but you will only know that to be true through your spiritual discernment, because a lot of false light is very shiny. It's very flashy. And it does contain partial truth. So it will give you that hit inside that's like, huh, that makes sense, or yeah, that does feel right. But it will also be laced with often bravado or performative gesturing, anything that is taking energy away from source and kind of redirecting it on to that person, or onto that particular system, or program. So we're really encouraged to pay attention to the false light. And of course, this doesn't just happen within spiritual movements. It happens within truther movements. It's happening within all of Hollywood. It's happening within all of our political system. All of that is a display of light and shadow right now, and specifically false light from Spirit's perspective, because even a good portion of our charities and activist movements, which rely on the heart energy and good intentions of others, are also based on this false light paradigm, where they're actually taking from the very people that they are claiming to serve. But we can only know this false light to be what it is when we have the eyes to see. And so we're encouraged to pray for that. And we're also encouraged, once again, to make space to receive the wisdom in the moment by meditating, and by taking that space to know who we are, and to want to come at life from a responsive place rather than from a reactive place. This is divine intelligence, Spirit says, when we come up against this false light without the true spiritual discernment of the wisdom of the divine feminine aspect of God. So that's why it's hitting home in some ways. We're getting divine intelligence out of a lot of these false light third eye codes. But when we don't have true spiritual discernment of the wisdom which comes from the divine feminine aspect of God, we may begin to believe this false light as true. And Spirit said, false light, we will be through false light, we will always be distracted toward a half truth or a shiny representation of source within. And it lacks access to the deeper wisdom, which is found within felt cellular and cellular experiences of God in our body. So if you aren't getting that like zing tingle, that feeling of like, oh my gosh, that like, I just got chills, or I just got goosebumps, that is God like resonating in our bodies. We know what that feels like when it happens. And so you may have moments of that within the false light. And when you experience that, take that, use your spiritual discernment to know, like, okay, that resonated as truth. But know that all that pretends to be light is not light. And so that is one of the most frequent weave errors that occurs, particularly when we are first awakening. The second, Spirit says, is resisting the weave instead of surrendering to it, especially the small things. And we will really be encouraged to learn divine obedience, and we will receive weave tests and challenges, which are not necessarily fun to the personality self, because they don't always come at comfortable or convenient times. And you will have that choice to like do what would make you look best to others in the moment, or go cry in a bathroom for 20 minutes, whatever the weave is calling for. But often when we do not listen, we kind of regret it later. And so we're really encouraged to surrender to the weave. And even the small things, and this is one of the things that my ego has and still has from time to time the biggest problem with, but definitely in the beginning, is spirit would encourage me, like, move something to the left, or like, go take your laundry out now. And I was either lazy or I just didn't feel like doing it or whatever, who knows, whatever prideful thing I was feeling in the moment, but I wouldn't do it. And then an hour later, the thing would like dump or spill everywhere, or, someone would mess up all the stuff that was in the laundry. And every time I would just be like, oh my God, like if I had just done the little thing. And now I've learned because so many times, like this crazy, I can't curse too much on here, but so much has happened that I do not. I move the thing. I now move the thing if it asks me to move it in that moment, and it's always a nudge. It's a lot of times when people get one-to-one readings, they'll say like, "Well, if I just heard spirit like you do," and it's like, well, we all have access to this, and it's not like spirit comes at me with a bullhorn, or sometimes if I'm way off track, but for the most part, it's subtle, and it's these nuances in the weavies. It's these slight activations. And for those of you who have had the private readings and mentorships, you know that a lot of the readings, and even here on Sanctuary, come through in lyrics, because spirit is kind of encapsulating the soul, is trying to encapsulate the most expanded like piece of information and offer it to us in the simplest, purest form. And often poetry and music is the quickest way to do that. So we're encouraged to surrender to this divine obedience within the weave, these tests, these challenges, and to surrender instead of, resist them. In spirits is especially the small things. And I'm sure that that was directed at me. So this bad attitude versus giving gratitude. When we start really tuning into the weave, the ego can take a lot of things as, or perceive them as, happening to us negatively. And once again, this goes back to these initiations, these weave tests, these challenges. But it's really hard sometimes not to have a bad attitude or not to fall into a victim consciousness. And yet, that is one of the greatest tests, to have this radical gratitude, this ability to stay true and firm in our gratitude, even when we are feeling not. And I remember, during some of the hardest times for me, I would have to be like, I have a roof over my head. I have running water. Like, I can sleep in a bed tonight. I have food to eat. Like, I had to just keep repeating these things over and over again, because otherwise I was going to fall really deep into this despair, or this helplessness or hopelessness, or even simply like resentment or victim consciousness. So once again, we're encouraged to don't think the weave is happening to us, but to remember that it's happening for us, and that we will always be given the perspective of the Holy Spirit when we ask to have eyes to see and ears to hear. So we can kind of chuck that bad attitude in the trash. Of course, it's okay to feel anything we need to feel. It's just that when we start directing it outward, or we start harming ourselves or our lives with it, then it becomes a problem. So encouraged to stay in this radical gratitude. The next weave error was overlooking weave cues because the mind deems them as too insignificant, mundane, or trivial to have the ego be bothered by them. And I think that's kind of what I was speaking to earlier, like, I don't feel like doing that right now. Or it just doesn't seem significant. Like, why? Like, that was what my ego would always like, why? I don't understand. And so that was something that I always had to come up against. I always had to have the consequence to be like, oh, that was the why. I guess that's why. And so when we overlook these weave cues, it's often just the mind, either being too busy, too distracted, or even, just forgetting, like, oh, I'll get to that, and then not doing it. And so knowing that it's actually the mundane and the trivial, what we term to be the insignificant codes, that actually often have the most give within our weave. So if we're finding ourselves to be stagnant, or like we're just not moving in the way we want to move, or we're feeling like we can't get balanced or not aligned, pay attention to the little things, because it's often the little things that are trying to get our attention the most. And then the last thing Spirit said was that often before a big weave shift in our lives, we can feel like a scrap of tissue paper, like floating in the wind. And it's very easy in that moment to give it all back, and to kind of, be that guy from the movie The Matrix that goes back and eats the steak. He's just like, you know what, this is too hard. I'm done. I'm going to pretend that it's real, even though I know it's not. And so it's very easy in that moment to cry uncle and to just opt out of the game. Like, this is too hard. I'm just going to eat a tub of ice cream. I'm just going to play, game on my phone, or I'm going to watch a show on Netflix, whatever it is we need to do to check out. And while that's okay, spirit is also alerting to us that it's actually a really powerful feeling to feel like this scrap of tissue paper, because it means that we are about to unfold a new big weave. And that when we resist it, or we avoid it, or deny it rather than surrender into it, then we lose some of its depth and some of its fulfillment. Of course, we never actually truly lose it, but we may for the moment. And so we're very much encouraged to pay attention that this is another frequent, quote, weave error that we might make when we are first awakening to this reality, where we start to realize that everything is speaking to us all the time.